Here's a question for you. What do you get when you get 38 years of experience fighting the federal government and beating them in court, including big cases against administrations like the FDA, and you get a passion from someone who has seen court orders been ignored by the federal government over and over, and you see someone who wants to make a change in the country for good and decides to run and try to take on a very powerful Democrat incumbent US Senator? Well, the answer is you get Jonathan Emord, and today I talk with him. Stick around and buckle up, because this is Fight and Revive with Adam Boyer.
America is no longer one nation under God. Are you ready to fight for revival? Well, then you've come to the right place. Welcome to Fight and Revive with Adam
Boyer. Okay, folks, as I said, I'm on the phone with Jonathan Emord, running for U.S. Senate in the Republican primary right now, and if making it to the general election, he'd be taking on current incumbent Senator Tim Kaine. Mr. Emord, thank you for coming on the show.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.
You as well. So, obviously you're running for the U.S. Senate, currently vying with several other candidates to become the Republican nominee. I'm not sure whether to congratulate you or offer my condolences that you're now running for office, but nonetheless, I thank you for it. So as we start off, why don't you give the listener some background of yourself in addition to what I said in the intro, and then tell us why you're running for this seat.
Okay, well, for the last 38 years, I've practiced constitutional and administrative law before the federal courts and agencies, and it's out of that experience that I really acquired a very deep understanding of the deep state and just how dire our situation is. We are really within 2 to 3 years of a loss of virtually every defense of individual liberty that we have if we don't reverse fundamentally the direction our country is going in. We are dabbling with socialism on the verge of really communism, and we have individuals who are so interested in feathering their own nests and improving their power positions that they've utterly neglected and forgotten the Constitution's limits and purposes. In fact, they don't like the Constitution one bit. So the reason why I'm running is that I think that if we don't get people in office who deeply understand the ideological origins of the Constitution and the purpose and meaning of the Constitution, we are going to be led by people who are just essentially without any respect for the rule of law and the Constitution and our rights, which, of course, our government was instituted for the very purpose of protecting our rights. That's what it says in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And yet, I think most Americans today who respect the rule of law and believe fundamentally that the Constitution ought to be followed appreciate well just how extraordinary the rights violations have been. So I came to Washington in 1985, and I was brought here during the Reagan administration. I was put into the position of an attorney in the Federal Communications Commission. When I was asked to come here, I responded that I didn't believe the FCC should exist, so why should I go to work for it? But the response was a Reagan-esque type of response, which is that's exactly why we want you to come out. So we worked to deregulate radio and television as much as we could, and I wrote a book, my first book called Freedom, Technology, and the First Amendment, in which I laid out a property rights program for ending the FCC, creating a private system for allocation of the airwaves, and one that would respect property rights rather than violate them. And then I left the FCC and went to work in the private sector, where I gained a reputation for defeating the government in federal court. And I've had the privilege of defeating the federal government 8 times in federal court, which is in the case of the Food and Drug Administration, which is one of the most oppressive agencies in Washington and very dangerous for us. And I beat them 8 times on constitutional grounds. And I also have defeated many other agencies in their own administrative courts, including the FTC, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Social Security Administration, the Bureau of Land Management, and so forth. So that's my history.
That's very impressive. Some of the biggest court cases involve those agencies, so that's a really big deal. So I'm very appreciative of that, and I'm glad you're able to get that accomplished. So you mentioned, and before I move on, I'll just say real quick, you mentioned that you wrote your first book back in the late 80s, I think you said. So you've written multiple books, correct?
Yes, I've written 5 books on law and government. My most recent one is called The Authoritarians, and it documents the rise of socialism in America from the origins of the collectivist thinking in America, which came in the antebellum South as a justification for slavery, and then follow it all the way through from 1860 forward to the present, and show how the movement to create a socialist America is really not new at all. It's been there in the administrative states since the earliest days of the Progressive Era, and it started with the 1886 passage of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and then continued on through the Roosevelt administration, the first New Deal and the second New Deal, and then gained tremendous speed in the 70s and 80s, late 60s, with mid to late 60s, starting with Johnson's Great Society programs forward. So we have a government that really is fundamentally different from the way the government was supposed to be. We started out with a constitutional republic in which the people were sovereign and their rights were to be protected by the government. In fact, that was the very purpose of the government. The second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence gives us the principles that define what it really means to be an American, and also what it means to govern in America according to a system that is in line with the foundational principles of Republican governance, and that is that, all men are created equal, of course. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator, God, not government, with unalienable rights to life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness among them, and that governments are instituted for the very purpose of protecting rights, and that just governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. And so those principles are all violated today by the Biden administration, by the Democratic majority in the Senate, and by the bureaucracy. To show you how far we've gone, it's a very simple formula. If you look at where the vast majority of laws that govern us come from, they don't come from our elected representatives. 3/4 of all federal law is not the product of those we elect. It's the product of the unelected heads of over 250 different federal bureaus, agencies, departments, and commissions. Those unelected people run this country. They form a bureaucratic oligarchy. So we've substituted for a federal republic of limited powers a bureaucratic oligarchy of unlimited power. And it's no mistake that Biden prefers not to go to Congress with anything. He rules by executive order and through the administrative state. His reason for that is it's easy for a dictator. If you want to be a dictator, you can be one. Just put in place those appointees in the various departments and agencies, and then once you've done that, you can rule by fiat or by dictate. And that's what Biden does. Like when, for example, he came on national television, told us that all those who didn't get vaccinated were deplorable people and that they all were hurting the rest of us, utter lie, and then that he would fix that by what? By having his agencies put in place a requirement that every employee in a company of 100 or more would have to be vaccinated or would have to be tested weekly in perpetuity in order to justify their employment. Otherwise, they'd have to be terminated. Well, he has no power under the Constitution to do that. He acted without an order he acted without a legislation from Congress, and Congress itself could not constitutionally legislate that requirement. And so it was held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because he violated the separation of powers doctrine. But every day he violates the separation of powers doctrine. Every day he implements new law through agencies. He doesn't go to Congress. So I wrote a bill many years ago for Congressman Ron Paul, who's endorsed my candidacy. And Congressman Paul, that bill was called the Congressional Responsibility and Accountability Act. And what it would do is require the agencies to have, if they wanted a law, wanted their regulations to have the force of law, they couldn't do it themselves. They'd be able to propose a regulation, but only Congress could make it law under this legislation. They'd have to propose it to Congress, and Congress would have to pass it. And it'd have to be signed into law, or there'd have to be an override of a veto in the way in which the laws are to be made, and that would restore Congress as the source of all law. And that bill also required that any existing law be adopted in the same way, or it would be sunsetted, eliminated, within 3 years of the passage of the bill. And that's a bill I'll reintroduce when I get into the Senate. But it's absolutely essential that we restore the American Republic. And we cannot hope to survive in a country with freedom unless we do that. We have to have the government's power checked, limited, and we have to expand as much as possible. The private sector and freedom will reign if we do that. And we'll have no energy problems, by the way, if we get the government out of the way, because we have more than enough energy to last over 1,000 years in this country. And we have cheap, affordable energy that's possible. Rather than paying $4.50 a gallon for gas, you can get it for $2 a gallon just by simply opening up the marketplace and ending this insane climate change agenda that the Biden administration has adopted. But that too, remember now, that too was adopted in large measure by regulation, not by legislation.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've really been intrigued by, but not in a good way, in that I've learned about so much over even the past couple of years, and I think COVID was a great example of that. I think people have really forgotten how tyrannical the government was during that time under both the Trump and Biden administrations. Both of them did some really bad stuff during COVID. But I mean, it's not new. As you said, the authority that unelected bureaucrats and the different agencies have is really incredible. And I think that's one of the things that we need with the Republican president, and we need Congress to take action on as well, is to limit the power of these agencies. So moving on, I'll get back to the Senate race. There's currently quite a few candidates running against you for the nomination. The most notable being Scott Parkinson, Hung Tsao, the former candidate for, I think, Virginia's 10th congressional district, former Attorney General candidate Chuck Smith, and Eddie Garcia. They're the most notable ones, in my opinion, anyway. However, so far you seem to hold an advantage over the others, both in terms of fundraising and name recognition. However, we're still over half a year out from the primary, and anything could happen. So, what do you offer to distinguish yourself and make yourself the best option when compared to the other candidates?
Well, I think fundamentally we face a constitutional crisis in this country. Our Constitution's hanging by a thread. And what we need is someone who can come into office with a background that has already established that that individual both intimately knows the enemy, the deep state, and also has defeated it, as I've done in federal court. By that knowledge, you can then translate what you know into legislation that can effectively disarm the administrative state, the deep state, and rearm the constitutional requirements that legislation be done through Congress, that we have the Constitution honored by following it rather than it being violated. The role of a senator is to create law. Well, we don't want to create laws that expand the power of government. We want laws that will diminish the power of government and restore the Constitution. So, in order to do that, you really need an expert in constitutional law, but you need someone who's not just an expert in constitutional law, but someone who loves the Constitution, has a consistent track record of defending it, and more importantly than anything else, has a track record of winning against the federal government on constitutional grounds. So I think that combination of factors makes my candidacy the best candidacy, and I think it puts me in a position of being able to help Virginians and help the nation save itself from what is really a very, very strong movement within the government and in the Democrat Party to make us a nation that is enslaved to the state. We were meant to be free, and we need people who understand really principally what American liberty is all about. You know, Thomas Jefferson well described what he called rightful liberty, and this is the American definition of liberty. This is the liberty that comes from honoring the Constitution. He said, rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to will, within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. He said, I did not say within the limits of the law, because the law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of an individual. So I think this is a moment when we need someone, more than anything else, to defend our rights against the rapacious efforts of the government to take away our right of self-defense, our Second Amendment rights, to take away our right of personal autonomy by forcing us to be vaccinated, by forcing us to wear masks, by trying to create a centralized digital currency that will take away all of our freedom, by requiring us to have some sort of medical identification card that would tell the government instantaneously on the local, state, and federal level whether we've been vaccinated or not, or whether we've taken the course that the government expects of us in any state of emergency declared by the government. And all of these things are happening so fast and from so many different areas that we really have to have someone who's rooted in the Constitution and who will fight for it. So that's why I think I'm the best candidate. And if I didn't think I was the best candidate, I wouldn't run. I'm not in this because I want to be in government, I'll tell you that. I can't stand the government. I've fought the government my whole career, and I understand well the abuses that come from the government. There's no greater threat to our liberty on earth than the government of the United States. You know, Abraham Lincoln put it this way, and prophetically, in 1838, when he gave an address to the Lyceum, the men's gym in Springfield, Illinois. He was at the time the head of the Whig Party in the legislature in Illinois. And he said, if destruction be our lot, we must be its author and finisher. As freemen, we will live for all time or die by suicide. We are in that zone where death by suicide is what is, the prescription given us by the Biden administration. The Biden administration doesn't argue like all predecessors in the Democrat Party used to try to argue, even though they were essentially self-defeatists. They would say, we're fighting for a better tomorrow, right? We're fighting to make the world a better place. We want a world better for our children. We could all hear that and say, yes, we agree with that. We just don't agree with your means. We don't agree with more government regulation and control to tell us what we should do. We'd rather be able to find for ourselves what our own employment is and put our resources to our own ends. But what the Biden administration is saying is that America's future is not great, that America is a failing nation, that tomorrow will not be better than today, and that we have to accept less in every way, less economic opportunity, less freedom, less of a position in the world, less defense of our interests at home and abroad. Well, I utterly reject that. I do believe that the greatest days for America are still ahead of us, and I believe that because so long as we are free, we can achieve. There's no limit to what Americans can do if they're free. If you enslave them, like they're trying to do right now, we're no different from any other country in the world. Abraham Lincoln also said America was the last best hope for freedom on earth. And it was true then, and it's definitely true now. If we don't keep freedom here, it is nowhere else to be found.
That's
This
true.
is a precious circumstance, a divine one, I think, that the Constitution of the United States was created for the very purpose of protecting our rights. And now they've so perverted the Constitution that it is being used as a justification to take away our rights. That's because it's been interpreted to mean the opposite of what it was intended to mean. So all of this points back to a very strong reality, which is because the Constitution of the United States is hanging by a thread, we need someone who understands its intrinsic meaning. And we need someone to fight for that in Congress. And the reason why I say in Congress rather than the courts is because I've spent 38 years fighting in the courts and winning. Yet despite my victories on constitutional cases, with mandates going to the agencies compelling them to abide by the Constitution, they have not. And the reason is, as was told to me by Eric Blumberg, who is an assistant chief counsel of the FDA, he said, you may have won that case, Pearson versus Shalala, Jonathan, and that is a novel case where the Food and Drug Administration, for the first time in its history, has been constitutionally required to stop censoring health information. But he said, the FDA will never, ever, ever abide by that decision. And I said, what? It's a final mandate from the federal court, from one court below the Supreme Court. The Solicitor General told the FDA he would not appeal it because it was a 3-0 decision in our favor. How is it that the FDA thinks it cannot abide by it? And he said, you don't really understand the power in Washington, Jonathan, where the power in Washington is. It's not with the court. It's with this agency. And I'm just telling you, it will never abide by that order. And you know what? He was right. I had to sue him again and again and again about it. But the fact of the matter was, that is part of the history that I understand. If we're going to change this, we have to do it with the power of the American people, fighting for our rights, not only in court, but in the Congress of the United States, stripping the agencies of power and restoring the power to the American people, and the freedom to choose to the American people. If we take these steps that I've outlined in detail on emordforva.com, if we take these steps, we will disarm government and rearm the American people. We will increase our individual liberty and sovereignty, our wealth and prosperity, our opportunity, our defense of our children, our parents' rights, and we will diminish the interference that government is making in our lives and the destruction of religion, the destruction of the fabric of our lives, and the destruction of the economy. That's why I think I'm the best person to do this.
That's extremely, extremely interesting. I'm so glad you're able to go into detail on that. I know, I think one of the most blatant examples of that recently, like you were talking about, where the some sort of government bureaucracy or some sort of government in general will just ignore a court, is when the Supreme Court last year in NYSRPA, I think versus Bruin was what it was, and if I'm not getting cases mixed up, when the Supreme Court struck down New York's unconstitutional concealed carry process, where basically, for all intents and purposes, they decided arbitrarily if they wanted to give someone a concealed carry permit. And New York basically said, no, not going to do that. Not going. Okay, you won, but we're gonna make you jump through a different hoop instead of having to just flat out denying you. You're gonna have to show that you really need it or something like that. The case was a while ago, but for all intents and purposes, that's what they said. And to my knowledge, nothing in New York has really changed since then. So that's a big issue, I think, that almost no one speaks about, so I'm glad to hear you talk about it. I'd like to get into the meat of some specific issues that are usually big deals in elections in general, but specifically in a Republican primary, starting off with a question on the Second Amendment. So, firstly, which, if any, gun laws, either locally in the state of Virginia or federally, are constitutional? And Are there any that aren't? And if so, can you think of any specifically?
I cannot think of a single restriction on the right to bear arms that could be constitutional. And the reason for that is that it's expressly disallowed by the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is an individual right. It's not a collective right. It's not some sort of right that exists today, but tomorrow it may be modified. No. The First Amendment, like the Second Amendment, is an absolute barrier to government in interfering with your right. Because it is a personal right that's vested in you, you don't have to ask permission to own a gun. You can own any gun you want in defense of your own life and liberty and that of your family without having to go ask government for permission, without having to register. The existing federal registration laws are unconstitutional. You cannot be presumed to have committed a crime simply because you own a gun. This whole idea that guns are responsible for crime is, of course, absurd. It's illogical in the extreme, and it's ridiculous. People are motivated to use a gun. Ordinarily, that's in self-defense or for hunting or for some other purpose, recreation, but it's not lawful, of course, to use it to kill someone or to rob someone. But only until you do such a thing are your rights then an issue. Before that happens, there's no right of prior restraint or power of prior restraint in the government. Just like the government can't forbid you from speaking because it presumes that you're going to say something that is harmful, that will cause an immediate injury to someone else, it cannot prohibit you from owning a gun on the presumption that somehow you're going to use a gun inevitably to cause an injury that is unjustified or unlawful. So we all start under our Constitution with rights vested in us under the Second Amendment. The government has no power to take our rights away, except upon proof following probable cause, arrest, and conviction that you have used the gun in the commission of a crime. So, for example, red flag laws, absolutely unconstitutional in the extreme.
That is the truth.
You can't go into someone's house because a neighbor calls the police and says that that neighbor thinks you have a gun and that you're not a reasonable, reliable person and might kill someone with it, and have the government go in and seize your property, your guns, in order to placate the neighbor and extend the power of the government in a prior restraint of your right to bear arms? Absolutely not. You can't deny someone the right to carry a weapon, concealed or otherwise, in the public. You have a right to do that. It's a self-defense right. You can't take that away. The Founding Fathers never understood that right to be one that could be violated. They reacted to a long history in England where, as a means to suppress one religious group or another, the Church of England, through the Crown, would confiscate weapons. They didn't want that to happen. They understood that you had a necessity for a right to bear arms for two fundamental reasons: self-defense, and then in the context of a well-regulated militia, the defense of a quote-unquote free state. A free state, in the minds of the Founding Fathers, is a republic. They referred to our republic as a free state. They meant the limited federal government of the United States and the state governments to be protected by a volunteer citizen force armed, a militia, that would be well regulated. What did that mean? That didn't mean under federal regulation. That meant that they were capable of understanding the martial arts and understood how to organize a unit for the defense of the state, a free state, and also of law and order, essentially a part of a free state. So what does this mean? This means if the Chinese form a police force in your community and take over the local government and turn it into a communist state because Biden has left the borders open and a million Chinese nationals who want to create a communist country in America come in entirely without any vetting and do that in some state, some town, well, you know what? The people in that state or town have a right under the Second Amendment to form a well-regulated militia and defend a free state. And in the case of the right to bear arms is an individual right. And so no one can confiscate your weapons. You have an absolute right to it. And the Founding Fathers understood arms to be very broad indeed. This idea that they did not understand arms to mean that someone could have a rifle is absurd, or that someone could use a knife in self-defense, absolutely ridiculous, and or that someone could not even have a cannon. This idea that, somehow cannons are not contemplated. Actually, they were. You know what? Most of the cannons used in the Revolutionary War came from private owners that were used on our side.
That's one of Biden's lines he repeats so many times. I've heard him say it so many times. It's one of his many lies. The guy lies incredibly, like with such ease. I think he can't distinguish the difference between truth and lie anymore, because he does do it with such ease. But that's one of the things he said over and over. When the Second Amendment was passed, you couldn't own a cannon. Actually, you could. So,
in fact, the cannon that is now a part of the Bunker Hill Memorial, which is actually, it was, I believe, Breed's Hill, where the Battle of Bunker Hill was actually fought. Not on Bunker Hill, but anyway, the cannon that is up there, was a cannon that was privately owned. It wasn't publicly owned. It's now on government property. If you go all across this country, he's so absurd on that. If you go all across this country, there are tons of people who own private cannons. You know that?
Yeah. They're all over the place, even around here. Up Route 24 through Rustbury. I mean, there's a house where they have not a monument per se, but a old Civil War style cannon just sitting in their front yard. And
now,
I'm sure
that's
it's
not
not
to say, people say,
right now.
my goodness, you own a cannon, you could blow up a whole set of buildings in town or whatever. Well, yeah, you can do all sorts of crimes, but that's not the point. The point of the Second Amendment is that you have a lawful right to own it so long as you use it legally. Now, if you go ahead and blow some building up, of course you're then going to be arrested and whatever. But the point is, if you have a property and you want to have your cannon on that property, you have an absolute right to do that under the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court has principally gotten this correct under the majority that exists now. In the Bruin case you mentioned, and you rightly mentioned that New York violated Bruin right after it was passed by repassing legislation that accomplished the very thing the Supreme Court said they could not do, which is to restrict your constitutional carry rights, essentially. I mean, you have every state in the Union should be constitutional carry by virtue of the fact, whether they say it or not, because that is the Constitution's requirement. And the idea that you have to go to the clerk's office here in Virginia and pay a fee in order to concealed carry a weapon, absolutely not. We need constitutional carry in Virginia. They violate our rights every day when they require people to do that. Yeah. If the fee were high enough, people would sue, I think. It's because it's relatively affordable that people say, well, it's an inconvenience. They don't like it. Most people who go through that process realize it's an intrusion. And you can't have a bureaucrat sitting over your First Amendment right to free speech, your First Amendment right to freedom of religion. Here you object to the vaccine. Well, we have, in Virginia, we have a right to a religious exemption. We don't have a conscientious exemption, and we have a medical exemption. Well, you know what? That's all messed up, too. Why? Because you have a right not to have the government require you to be injected with something. The government has no right to inject you with something. You don't have to go to the government and ask for an exemption under the proper interpretation of the Constitution. The government has to come to you to ask, and if you say no, then the government has no power to compel you. Well, the way this is written, right, when your kids are going to go to school, the idea is, they really can't go to school unless they're vaccinated. And then you have to invoke a exemption on a government form and sign it with a notary that says, I have determined that under my religious views, it's exempt. Well, you know what? The government has no power to inspect your religious views. If the government inspects your religious views, they violate your freedom of religion. Because why? Because your religion is yours. It's an individual right. What you think is a religious scruple is your business. The government has no business in telling you what is religion and what is not. And so there is, and this is likewise with the Second Amendment. The government has no business in sitting there saying, oh, well, because you live in this part of the town and there's been a lot of gun violence, you shouldn't have a gun. Of course, it's counterintuitive to everybody who owns a gun. Of course you want to have a gun in an area where there's violence. That's like the idea that, no gun zone around a school or whatever. Okay, well, look, if you do that, what are you doing? You're advertising to those who are sick, who are criminals, who want to use a gun and kill kids, that they can do it with impunity at the school. Why? Because it's a gun zone. Because if you go into that area, you can be counting on yourself as being the only person with a gun. Well, if we don't create an environment where we have today, given the threats that exist, where we have responsible individuals who are militia or who are sheriff's deputies, largely deputized expansion of the sheriff's offices, trained and understand how to use a weapon, and have them in our schools to protect our kids, then we're going to have those situations like they have everywhere else where there'll be 17 minutes of a rampage before the police arrive. And a whole bunch of kids will be killed. Well, what would happen if within a fraction of a second the offender is subdued? Or better yet, what would happen if the offender pulls a weapon and is surrounded by individuals who pull weapons? That would mean that there would be very short opportunity to kill any innocent child. And that would reestablish a situation that existed in our country for many years. The right to bear arms has only recently become a thing that has been attacked with this amount of vigor. In earlier parts of our history, people in the West, you'd never think of a school shooting, because if you shot somebody in a schoolroom, a whole bunch of kids would pull out their weapons and kill you.
Correct.
So it's the deterrent factor. When they plan these things out, these school shootings, they're doing it with confidence that there's no opposition.
Another thing I'm glad you mentioned is the idea of a militia, not exactly in the same context when the Constitution says a well-regulated militia, but like what we think of local militia, like there is one here in Campbell County. I hope to actually have a guy on that's a part of the militia here soon to talk about the importance of them, because that is something that's very important. The scenario you laid out, I think local militia can be very important, but when the government's intruding on our gun rights, that makes it much harder to have a militia, which of course is their point.